ended the last volume at the other side of the hill, and now we're this side of the hill, and you can see the dam in the background, and moved on from the Ast, and here we are with volume 3.
Yes, the hill you can see down there is the one that the old Molwyn Tunnel went through, which is a pretty good thing that they built a deviation and that we don't have to go through that again, because it was, from all accounts, from Will Jones, who I used to work with years ago, the tales he told me about working in there, pretty horrendous. There was very little in the way of places to get out the way of trains. Couldn't see anything. The water was almost up level with the tops of the rails, and if you did any packing in there, apparently you just leave a rail up with a bar and use the pointed end of a beta pick just to try and flow some muck underneath it. If you used the fat end, you'd drown yourself. So that hill, that ridge, which I've always felt is like a weather barrier. The other side of it is green and pleasant land, and up here it's, well, in the winter certainly, it's a little bit like the surface of the moon, and quite often there's snow this side and not the other side. You mentioned the dam that you can see down there. It's the old Archer Dam, I think they called it, which apparently produced hydro power for must have been a water wheel in some way to haul the slate wagons up. You can see an incline down there that goes over the hill. Before the old tunnel was built, that incline was a barrier to the gravity trains, and the water power somehow wound the things up it and then down the other side. I don't think today we'd probably get away with how the deviation was built right through the middle of it by just knocking a big hole through this monumental great dam, but there it goes. It's one of the features of the railway, I suppose. This is an interesting place to start because for reasons that we never really understood, we were commanded to effectively bring a railway by road up to here and lay it down to the tunnel, which, whether that was for access to the tunnel or to show intent on building the railway perhaps to the power station people or whatever, if it was something to do with the tunnel, then the contractors who got involved in it every day cursed the track because they had to walk along it instead of being able to drive along it. Anyway, we set about moving approximately a bit over a quarter of a mile of track, that's the rails, the sleepers, all the fastenings, from Minford and Gwnaethpwyd depots, two ends of the railway, by road, round through the power station, and there was all the planning we did for it. Everything depended on the ability to be able to get road vehicles up a very steep ramp this side of the power station, up onto the site that farmers' tractors and the like would go up. In those days, the railway had a road haulage depot in Leeds, because we used to get gifted workshop machinery and all sorts of things, so it made sense to have it there. And so they said they'd bring their trailers and their tractor unit down here, and they reckoned that one of their drivers was mad enough to try and get up this ramp. Well, the whole thing depended on it. We drew up a plan that involved 3 trailers, I think, 2 tractors and a big crane. We owned a crane in those days. And a whole week's work. On the first day it started to rain and it got worse all through the week. This area had been, how should we say, levelled out by the deviationists. And in those days they had a little tracked dozer, Massey 244 I think it was. And it was a bit of a swampy, lumpy, undulating mess, ledge on which we had to lay a railway. The first day we came up here with the first lorry, with a great load of rails, got through the power station, special permission to come through it. Came to the bottom. I was in the cab, the first one, with this crazy driver, and there in front of us was this ramp, and he put his foot down and the thing roared up it. We thought, hey, we cracked it, wonderful, you know, no problem. Just a bit further up here, there's a culvert, and the way they built the culverts was before they built the embankment that it goes through, they put the pipes and they encased it in concrete, and then filled up around it, built up the track bed. Well, having got up this hill, we had to come along the track bed and drive over one of these things. And because it was concrete in the middle and it roughly filled in at the sides, of course the lorry's wheels sunk either side of it. And it just sat down and its wheels went, whoa, and the more they spun, the more it sat down. We tried pushing it with the little dozer, we tried pulling it with it, we tried everything. And in the end we had to unload all the rails way back up there to get the thing out, which wasn't really what we wanted. No. I think it probably the second day we were up here, and the crane was down that end, because that's towards where we were going to unload everything. And there was a vague sort of turning area, and he backed into that to turn the thing round, and it sunk. This is a big 3-axle, big red fire engine looking like thing. Esmeralda, we called it. Yeah. God knows why. And it sunk. There's big back wheels on one side just sunk, and we thought, oh my God, that's ruined it. What do we do now? Because the crane was having to go up to Blaenau and back to Minffordd now and again to load things, and there it was sitting looking very sorry for itself. But Andy Putnam, who worked initially at Boston Lodge, but mainly up here around the tunnel job, and finally moved up to Gwnaethpwyd with Project Blaenau that we'll come to later on. And I mean, he became one part of my department, and he was absolutely the bloke to fix things. And he'd also, before he came here, he'd worked for Sparrows, a crane company which became Greystone White and Sparrows, if I remember right. He got a lot of experience with that sort of thing. And in 2 hours, he got the thing out. Because they, it's like a 6-wheel lorry, if you like, with a crane that can turn 360 degrees on it, and it's got a big counterweight, and the jib on that side, and so by using the weight of the counterweight and putting the jib right up so it's almost beyond vertical, it took all the weight off these wheels, and it would start tipping a bit, so he'd pack underneath them and then kind of lift it up until it could drive out again. You know? So that was that little element of despair done. Next thing, we got these lorries, trailers, unload them down here, and we said, how do we get out? I don't want to reverse them all the way, we've got to turn it round. And we thought, uncouple the trailer, lift it up with a crane and turn it. And I thought, if this was my dinky toys at home, I mean, not that I play with dinky toys anymore because I got real ones. And there was this kind of area like that up against the hill. So I said to the crazy driver, how about this for an idea then? Start going backwards and sort of tuck your trailer into there so that it goes up into the hill, and then just put your foot down and keep going, because the tractor will go swinging round, it'll end up pointing that way. And he gave me a funny look, got in his cab and tried it, and it worked. So every one of them, that's what we did, and it just kind of spun it round on the back wheels. Probably the bloke who inspected the trailers wouldn't have been too pleased, because we backed it halfway up a hill. So now we got all the materials for 1/4 mile of railway up here, and for a loop to run around, because the plan, what we're working towards, of opening the railway in stages instead of one leap to Blaenau, like originally I think was the idea. So because of work up towards the power station and beyond, once the tunnel was through, then the train service ran up to here for not very long, 1977 I think season it ran here, and this was a terminus, during which time we were laying the track onwards up there. And you can actually see this section we're on, at each end of it, there's a wiggle.
Yes.
Or a reverse curves,
Yeah.
is a more technical way of putting it.
Yeah.
And I think some people probably look at it and think, oh, wonder why that is. And obviously the reason, because there was another track there
Yeah.
for the locomotive run round. All this stuff, debris, all along here,
Yeah.
and various other places, apparently is all from the excavations for the pump storage hydro station, which goes down pretty deep, and there's enormous excavations for the pressure pipes and all sorts, and they've all been dumped all around the place and kind of landscaped. And then of course we dug through this.
Yeah.
And nature is gradually, well, fairly rapidly
Taking over.
curing it. Yeah, that's the Ffestiniog pumped storage power station,
Yeah.
even though it's at Tanygrisiau. You can't see much of it from here, and there's as much as you see from here going downwards underneath it to the bottom of the lake,
Yeah.
so they can pump the water back up again. Up that way is a whole series of inclines,
Yeah.
that actually came down just out of sight, just up there, and then the railway goes disappearing round there, and we actually go behind the power station. So we start wandering that
down.
way. Yeah.
What it's all about.
And hope a train doesn't come.
So we're now stood behind the power station here at Tanygrisiau, which is obviously the reason why the deviation had to take place in the first place.
Yeah, that's true. The old route was pretty well underneath the power station. As you've seen it, we can't quite see it now,
No.
but it was sort of right on the edge and in front of the power station and along the road. So, yeah, so this is part of a pump storage scheme. There's a lake here which hasn't got much water in it today, but when it's full you can see where it gets to by the sort of tide line. Way up there, 1,000 feet up, out of sight from here, but very visible from coming up along the road from Dolgelli. It looks like a viaduct or something right up in the mountains. It's a massive dam. It is a truly massive thing, and it's worth actually going up to it if you can. There's a road zigzags all up, you know, like a James Bond road.
Yeah.
And the two are connected by pipes, and it's kind of like a battery in a way, I suppose. Water up there can come down the pipes, drive the turbines to generate electricity. But I think originally when this thing was built, my understanding was it was say, connected to Rhwng, which you can't really turn it down. So when there's not a big demand, they can use their excess electricity to reverse this thing, and there's pumps right down deep underneath it, which would pump the water from here back up to there.
So that,
yeah, and the tale that went about it was when Coronation Street finished, everybody gets up and goes and puts their kettle on.
there's a sudden surge for electricity.
I didn't, because I never watched Coronation Street, because I thought it was pretty nauseating. That's upset a lot of people. And so there'd be an immediate demand, because kettles, what, 2.5 kilowatt, something like that. They take a lot more than most people think, and they'd all be switched on at once. So this thing would be on, I think they called it spinning reserve, just spinning it slowly, and then they could open the valve, poof, and thousands of gallons of, hundreds of tons of water would come down. So the whole deviation was built to get around this thing, and the only way around it was to climb, which we saw back down the other end last time, round the spiral, new tunnel, climbing all the way. We're now pretty well at the summit, although it's not that easy to look along it and see the summit, but there's the summit,
the marker.
gradient post, and then it goes downhill to Tanygrisiau and then carries on uphill to Blaenau. And of course what that means is the railway can never run a gravity train all the way from Blaenau Ffestiniog to Portmannog again, which is what the railway was built for.
Yeah.
Because no matter how fast you came down a bit from Blaenau, if you went fast enough to get up the hill, you'd come off on the curves. I'm sure. We've never calculated that, but I just have a strong feeling I'm right.
Don't really want to try it.
It'd be fun though, wouldn't it? So, one of the difficulties with this route around here is that these, what they call the pressure pipes, from the top lake to here.
Yeah.
And if you imagine the weight and the pressure of the water from up there driving the turbines, all being pushed back up again, there's one hell of a force in these pipes. And I think there was some wariness about having trains running over the top of it. So you wouldn't know where the pipes are, really, would you? But there are actually 4 bridges. That before the railway, the formation, the ballast and everything was laid, there was 2 vast holes here. See that sort of lump of rock by itself, and there's a sort of grassy bit beyond and a grassy bit this side, and each of those was a massive great excavation. And the pipes come up. There's 4 generator units in there, and there are 4 pipes underneath here, and each one of those pipes had a big concrete bridge built over it, and the pipes are going up on quite a gradient, and the whole thing was backfilled with sand to within about 6 inches of the top. And then they go on up there, and up, see the light up there? There's a huge access chamber there, and it goes into a tunnel. Then more or less, it must have a bit of a down gradient, but it goes right in, and then it comes up. So the water comes down, and down the tunnel, then splits into the 4. Strangely, the crossing a bit further down here that got called the Valve House crossing, and that's what gets in the rule book, and that's kind of what it's called now. But as far as I'm aware, there aren't any valves there. And they call it the Portal Access Road, but we call it the Valve House, so that's what it's known as. So that's what if we talk to the controller or whatever, that's what we have to say. We've just seen several people walking across here, including kids who normally are brighter than their parents, and not one of them has looked at this track and said, why are there 4 rails? Or are they electric rails, or what? It's a good question, really, isn't it? So why are there 4 rails? Well, it's all because of the power station and their concern that should a train derail,
that it was going to go down the
and
bank.
roll down the bank and into all the transformers and the distribution stuff, there would be a catastrophic banging and splatting. It would cost somebody, probably us, an awful lot of money.
So they put in check rails.
Wouldn't do the train much good either. So these guardrails, as I think is the correct term for them, this was decided apparently by somebody in an office in Manchester, because they were shown on a drawing as starting from about where we started, and going right through that cutting to the other end, because that's where their boundary fence used to be. So they drew it between their boundary fences. One went up there and the other there. Well, we had to buy the rails from somewhere, and I thought, well, what's the point of putting them through the cutting, where if a train did derail, it can't get down there and it will go that way anyway. So we didn't do quite what we were told. Actually, we bought these things from a scrap man who is based in Port Penryn near Bangor, which funnily enough is where we bought loads of the Penryn Quarry Railway from. And we paid for them with twice their weight in scrap rail. And a firm in Penryn did a lot of haulage work for us, Pierce's. He had, well, actually we went there with a lorry with a brand new back tub on it to get these rails, and we went into their scrapyard with the ones that we'd taken there for them, and they had a magnet crane, which was a Ruston Bucyrus or something or other, normally an excavator, but he got a generator on the roof for a magnet crane, right? And he was picking these rails out the thing with his magnet and dumping them, and then we were selecting the ones of these that we wanted, and he was picking them up with a magnet, and the ones he didn't want, he was trying to shake them out, and every time he picked a few up, one of the ones we didn't want would stick to him.
Yeah.
And he was getting furious with this, so one time he picked a load up and he whirled it round and switched it off. And they went scattering everywhere, and then he picked out the ones we wanted. But then he just got a bundle above the lorry, this guy's brand new lovely lorry, and the generator ran out of fuel.
Ah.
So they went bong on the top of his lovely thing, you know. So then he climbed up on the top, put some fuel in it, started it, but it wasn't a self-bleeding diesel, and he hadn't bled it properly, so he just picked the next lot up and it stopped again. And so this went on. But where he got these from apparently was in Beaumaris on the Isle of Anglesey.
Okay.
And I think it was a shipyard of some sort, and these were for the things to launch the ships down onto the beach. And there must have been ones going 90 degrees across, so you could traverse the things as well, because some of them had notches cut out of the head. And when he picked them up and threw them around, they just broke through the notches, which is fortunate in case we'd have brought them over here.
Yeah.
And there was some discussion about how we should mount these things, because our normal sleepers were 4'6" long.
Yeah.
And so the screw on the outside of these would have been so near the end that if something had derailed, they wouldn't have contained it.
Yeah.
So we'd been fortunate in getting from the Glasgow Underground Railway up in Glasgow, believe it or not. They were relaying the whole thing, rebuilding it all, and they had, because it was a tube, 2 tubes, then the sleepers had chamfered ends.
Yeah.
So they'd sit, and I think it was a 4-foot gauge. It's a weird one anyway. And they had a stock of about 200 elm brand new sleepers, which I think had been tannalised or some sort of chemical treatment anyway. And so I bought these along with all sorts of fastenings and bits and pieces. And so they were long enough to put here with the chamfered ends underneath.
Yeah.
To mount these on the end. And the Railway Inspectorate wanted us to prove that they could contain a derailed train. And we thought, well, how the hell are we going to do that? And we thought, well, we'd set one up at Minford with a couple of rails and about relative to the end where they are, and put a few jacks between them and just started jacking them up, putting as much force as we could onto it, and we couldn't burst it through the end. So the inspectorate said, yeah, it's fine, no problem.
Oh, there you go.
Well, almost in sight of the deviation end now.
Yeah.
Fort Lewis was just down on that big patch of open ground there.
Open expanse.
When it was there, I mean, it was like a small industrial site.
Yeah.
And it arose, I think, primarily because although the bulk of the deviation had been a totally volunteer thing, the CGB, as this was, Central Electricity Generating Board, weren't happy, understandably perhaps, of a bunch of what they saw sort of enthusiasts playing with explosives and digging holes in the ground on their land above their pipes behind their power station.
Yeah.
So they insisted on I think it was a management contract.
Right.
And McAlpines had that contract, and this great big base was set up here, sort of a typical compound that you see on any big construction job.
Yeah.
Loads of huts, tanks, even a mast probably, so they could radio back to their headquarters, send more coffee or whatever. And in this place there was by then quite a lot of railway employed staff.
Yeah.
Like Bunny Lewis,
Yeah.
who we told you all about in part 2.
Yeah.
Big Bunny. And this place that was set up and officially called Llanelli, which I think translates as view of the lake, which is a bit obvious really, isn't it? Very rapidly became known as Fort Lewis, which seemed to stick, and most people thought that's a good name for it because Bunny was the deviation, you know.
Yeah.
And in it was Andy Putnam a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And a guy called David Payne, or David Early Payne, I think. I never knew whether that was his name or whether it was because he was early. But it was quite a bustling sort of place with loads of people scurrying around. And this section from Ffestiniog, just out of sight down there, that became the temporary terminus. And for that year, while that was a terminus, loads of work was going on with the formation along here, including over the pipes, all through the protected area, if you like, down to there, 2 level crossings that you can see down there, several quite big culverts. Here comes a jet. A tornado! Oh! We're over here! Look at that, eh? That was a Panavia Tornado GR4, just for the record. Yeah, back to Fort Lewis. One of the things with Fort Lewis that became almost a ritual was the daily fish and chip run.
You told me about your daily fish and chip runs with your slightly soggy paper
Yeah,
by the time
I wouldn't eat them now. They were, well, then they seemed fantastic because a lot of it was in the winter. I spent quite a lot of time up here when all this was going on. And you came up here early enough to get your order, and they'd phone it to Woolways in Blaenau, and Woolways was a good chippy then, as long as you ate it fresh from the, you know. And a bloke that we called Coco, God knows why, a clown maybe?
Maybe.
He usually went with the Wentworth hire van, and he'd go off to Blaenau and he'd come back with his box of steaming fish and chips. And we'd all be sitting on decaying armchairs in there that people had donated to it, with gallons of coffee and steaming soggy fish and chips. But because it was raining and windy and cold outside, it was great. It was, you know, there's several stages in this whole march forward towards Blaenau Ffestiniog, and this was definitely a significant one. Partly because of the fish and chips and the atmosphere in the place, but partly it was the only part of it really that was not wholly Ffestiniog, because we had the contractors, McAlpines. And we had all sorts of different contractors and specialists and all that involved with the tunnel, the shotcreting, pumps, a firm called Tissons, and there's loads of them. You look in any civil engineering magazine and you see all these names. Most of them were here at some time or other. There was a ramp going down across there onto the track formation, up which and down which all the various bits of machinery, dumpers and all sorts of things would tend to come back here broken, and Andy would mend them and then off they go again. It was quite amusing. Andy Putnam, who was definitely one of the characters of this end of the railway, and he was a bit of Bristolian and you know, and he had a big armchair in there, and he spent most of the time from early in the morning till pretty well everyone went home, sitting in his chair drinking coffee and smoking. And people would talk about it and say, oh, doesn't he ever do anything? Who is that guy? He's a lazy bugger, isn't he? And his response to that was, because he was the plant manager or plant engineer for the whole of this lot, including the tunnel and the train to take the concrete down, the pumps, everything. He looked after it all. He used to get up here about 6 o'clock in the morning, go down, get everything checked over, oils, water, everything, get them all running, then come back here. And he said, while I'm sitting in my chair, he says, everything's working. You don't need to worry. He says, when I'm not here, you should worry. That summed it up, absolutely. You know, because as soon as something went wrong, Andy was gone like a shot.
He'd fix it.
And he didn't come back until it was working. And even if that was tomorrow, he'd be down in the tunnel making it all work. I mean, he was a fantastic guy. But it's kind of every railway should have one. You know.
So we've got the dam here, and one of the other routes, the eastern deviation route, was planned to go over the dam. Was it not?
It was, which I thought was quite incredible. If you ever walked across it, try and imagine a huge great train coming thundering across there. Whether they'd still had a footpath across it, I don't know. But it's a good spot here to see way down through the quarry over there. I believe it would have gone through that quarry, and then there'd have been a short tunnel through just where you can see Ffestiniog power station, which was designed to fit beautifully in with all the scenery, so that it wouldn't stand out and like an eyesore, you know. And there would have been a tunnel somewhere underneath it, and then a great horseshoe at the other end to join the route at the far end of the tunnel we now have. Yeah, that would have been quite a spectacular route, I think. And I think it's probably politics more than anything that decided it was going this side. It'd be worth mentioning, I think, that I mean, the deviation, the 2.5 miles of the deviation, all I'm really talking about is the track, from the track laying and the ongoing maintenance and whatnot. But the deviation itself, like with the deviationists or the deviants or whatever you like to call them, and the goings on and all the strange happenings, all the civil type stories about it, is worthy of a whole story, a whole film. Brian Hollingsworth, who for some years was, I suppose he was my consultant civil engineer, and he lived not far from here, and he wrote a book called Ffestiniog Adventure, and it's all about the deviation, and it's very good. I dug it out the other day to just sort of look for some odd facts about this, that and the other, looking for dates, and I found some but I can't remember them. But it's a good book. I don't know whether it's still obtainable. I'm sure it is in, I don't know, second-hand places or something. But I would thoroughly recommend that anybody interested in the deviation reads it. There you go. It's a bit of commercialism.
So now we've walked sort of further around from Fort Lewis. We've got a road crossing there, and then Tanygrisiau station a bit further up towards the end of the deviation. Yep,
there's a lot of kind of interest from the railway history, I suppose, because down there where the road is was the old Ffestiniog Railway before the power station took it over. Before that, the line came much more in round here, and I think some of the old photographs, they show it on a big embankment with a water wheel somewhere, which would be over amongst those old foundry over there. Yeah, the end of the deviation, you can actually pretty well see it straight through there. You can see the two little red starting signals at the far end of Tanygrisiau station, and that's pretty well where, because we're on the downhill now from the power station summit, then just about the end of the station is where it gets back onto the uphill.
Yeah.
And this is a good point to see if you think if they'd used the east side route and come across the dam,
Yeah.
how the hell would it have got up to the level of the station?
That's quite a way.
Without presumably digging a cutting through the station.
Yeah.
I mean, there must have been a plan to do it, else
Yeah.
they couldn't have gone that far and just suddenly thought, oh, Christ,
Now what do we do?
6 feet higher, we'll have to think of something else.
Yeah.
These crossings were, from our point of view, a bit of a pain in the butt, like any crossing,
Yeah.
because the track's encapsulated in them.
Yeah.
Once it's all tarmacked, there's not a lot you can do to it
No.
without breaking it out. We've got track circuits around here because of the two crossings,
Yeah.
with the flashing lights and the weeboo 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 thingy, and the train runs onto the track circuit. So this whole area from pretty well the top of near the summit up there,
Yeah.
right round to Tanygrisiau station is track circuited. And the way we built the crossings, because it's flat bottom running lines,
Yeah.
and we got no special base plate come chairs to put a conventional check rail in for the flangeways.
Yeah.
We made up a kind of well, we called it a ladder. We're using half bullhead chairs,
Yep.
just broken in half, and the two rails with a half chair that way and a half chair that way, and tie rods between them,
Right.
so that you sat it in the middle, screwed it to the sleepers, but no part of it touched the running rails. And there was a sufficient gap, you know, until it started filling up with brake dust and this, that and the other, so we'd have to clean it out. But gradually both the train and the road traffic get it all dancing up and down, and the running rails would start going down and leaving the check rails high.
Yeah.
And even some of the things, dare I say, with worn wheels and tired springs and whatnot, actually scraping along on the check rails.
It's not good.
So every time it got like that, you've got to open them out again. And that applies to all the crossings
Yeah.
throughout the railway, which is why we experimented largely successfully with Lotties and Penryn and Glanapwth up near Blaenau, of doing away with the check rails completely.
Yeah.
And just tarmacking over the whole thing, level with the line. And while the stuff was still warm and soft, drive our engine up and down it a few times and make the flangeways. And thinking being, well, if the surface bit starts breaking up around the flangeways, we'll just scrape a bit out and redo it.
Yeah.
And drive it over again. Simple.
Did it work?
Yeah. Except the one at Lottie's is a bit of a mess, but that's, I think, largely because it's such a steep hill.
It is very steep.
And the nutters with their cars come hurtling down and go like that, and then you can see where they land, the exhaust pipes or whatever dig into the road, you know.
Yeah.
And I think they ripple it when it's hot.
They do.
That one hasn't been done. I think that one has been, but it's definitely something that worked.
Yeah.
Talking about that, how do we lay the track along here? I suppose we did it very well. I would say that.
Yeah.
But compared with how we go about things now and the amount of equipment there is around and everything, we laid the track from this end of Llynistadau Holt.
Yeah.
Started in January '78. And they hadn't quite finished all the earthworks along here.
Yeah.
And we'd been saying for some time before Christmas, we're going to start in January and in 2 weeks we'll be here. So you better finish it. And they didn't believe us, did they? And in 2 weeks we were here and they hadn't finished. We had a big stock of rails, 75-pound rails again. Can't remember where they came from. It might have been RAF Welford down near Newbury. But anyway, we had a mountain of them at Tanygrisiau. All the sleepers were all brought up, all pre-drilled.
Yeah.
And you see, each one has a little hole there.
Yeah.
That tells you that's the top.
Oh, there you go.
Because the drills sometimes, through a jig, they can wander a little bit.
They can, yeah.
So if you use the hole at the other end, they'd be all over the place.
Yeah.
So everything there, all set up. Little bit of track beyond the operating bit to start on with the train, with a load of rails, and with a little four-wheel trolley that got called the bomb trolley. Tiny little thing, little wheels about so big, a pretty stout metal frame, and the way we did it, we got the first pair of rails on the rail carriers with a rope tied to a bit of track that was still ahead of us.
Yeah.
And pulled the train out from underneath it.
Yeah.
And somebody had marked the middle of the rail, and as the train went along, he moved the little trolley until it stopped underneath the chalk mark.
Yeah.
The train went on, and the rails came down, sat on the little trolley, sat on it like that. Then you wheeled them along, and we had a piece of very light track that two people could pick up and walk with.
Right.
The trolley ran off the end of the main rails onto this little fabricated bit, which was sitting on the sleepers, laid out on the prepared ballast, all vibrator rolled and beautifully manicured, not a stone the wrong way up. And as it ran onto it, it came to the end of that rail, and the length of it was just right, so as it came to the end and sort of fell off, it bounced up a bit, and the rails kind of slithered off the side of it, dropped onto the ends of the sleepers, took the trolley back, picked up the length of temporary, moved it forward. And while we were getting the next pair on off the stock wagon, just pushed these ones in and fish plated them on and screwed about every third sleeper just quickly to hold it together, so the whole thing could progress. And then follow that up, screwing all the rest of them, squaring everything up, knocking it all into alignment and so on. And it went at a tremendous rate.
I'm not surprised. It sounds it.
But I think by the time we got to doing this bit, we'd kind of got 30 years experience behind us. And we really whipped through it, and the deviationists got the surprise of their life when they came back from their New Year revelries and found the track was up here somewhere. The crossings, from what I can remember, they were done rather temporarily to start with, so we could continue through it. In fact, I've got a feeling we just put the rails through and filled it all in or something, so we could run the train over it, you know? Then come back and sort it all out later on. What else is around here? The Riskin Incline, which is just up there, the little tunnel. There's loads of quarries up there with huge great holes going deep down right into the bowels of the earth. And on the top of there, just, if you can imagine that tunnel going up at that angle, it comes out just beyond the crest. And then there's a level area, and whether it's still there or not, I don't know, but there was a bit of an old winding engine there. And there's, right on the top, was a platform with a rail, handrail round it. In fact, there's one of them from somewhere over there is actually still visible, a little thing. And apparently the winder guy used to come and stand up there and wait till the guy at the bottom was hooking on the empties onto the cable to wind them up. And when he'd wave, then he'd go back to his engine and wind them up. And old Will Jones that I worked with for 4 years, who was forever telling us amazing tales about the old railway, all the things that happened, and a lot of the things that probably imagined happened. And he says the guy who hooked them on, he had a big white handkerchief that he would wave to the bloke at the top. And one day he had a cold, and he got the hook in his hand. He hadn't hooked it on yet. He felt a sneeze come in, so he whipped his handkerchief out of his pocket to blow his nose, and the bloke rushed down, opened the throttle on the engine, and up went the bloke hanging onto the hook all the way to the top. So Will said. But I heard the story so many times, and like the core bit of it, I think probably the bloke did go up the hill. With the hook. It's a good story anyway, isn't it?
Here we are at the final bridge before we actually get into Tanygrisiau station, and the end of the actual deviations. We can see like the switches and the crossings of where it goes to where the trains cross over. So this is just sort of one of your final big obstructions before actually getting...
Yeah, the end was in sight.
The end was in sight.
Yeah. This bridge is several T-beams. Came from, I think it's Taunton.
Yeah.
Where there's a big place makes them for VR and all sorts, doesn't it? And they're something like 60 feet or more long. And apparently they came around the north coast and over the Crimea with this huge, great extended trailer with these things on. And people asking the driver, did you come over that way with all those bends? And he says, well, there's not so many now. Because they've probably gone up on all the, knocked all the walls down, really. But when it came to build this thing, the station area was just a big open space. So they could back the lorries up more or less to where these trees are.
Yeah.
And the crane stood just over there. So in theory, you could just lift them off, jib out and put them down. And something I never quite got to the bottom of myself, but sounded very much like there'd been a bit of confusion over what these beams weighed.
Right.
I mean, they were obviously a big, heavy thing, being 60 feet long and sort of that by that of reinforced concrete, pre-stressed concrete. And apparently they'd ordered a 50-ton capacity crane. They'd only got a 100-tonner. So we got a 100-tonner at the price of a 50.
Yeah.
And initially it struggled with it. Don't believe too much if you read Brian Hollingsworth's book. Brian Hollingsworth expressed everything in forms of nice, even if it wasn't.
Yes.
If you know what I mean. And where he says something like the big 100-tonner kind of made an easy job of it, well, I was here.
Yeah.
And I think the guy perhaps was a little thinking, oh, a 100-tonner and they only wanted a 50, this will be a doddle.
This will be absolutely fine.
Anyway, but when he picked the first one up with a lorry alongside him, it swung a bit and it seemed a little bit, oh, and the people were all backing off a bit. So he quickly put it down again, rigged it up a bit more, stabilisers everywhere, there's a train coming somewhere.
There is.
And it's all right, we'll see all those things start flashing before it gets here.
Yeah.
And so then he set the thing up really good and proper, all its out, I was right on the edge, picked this beam up and he had a jib out, and I reckon it was pretty well at his limit for the reach and the weight, and he was kind of seemed to be swinging them across and putting them down.
Yeah.
And I suppose once they got the first one, then the next one just went across and sat beside it.
Yeah.
And the initial one would have to be placed very carefully, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
But it's definitely interesting just standing on one side and thinking, I'm glad it's not my job to do that. But so now you'd never know the T-beams up underneath it because it's all been built over with concrete. If you go underneath it, you can see the kind of rubbery, corky stuff that goes between them and everything. Yeah. Sometimes you can't get underneath it.
Yeah.
Because there's so much water coming down here.
From that waterfall.
That it's, well, literally washing the side of the trains.
Yeah. I've been on a train when it's done that many times.
Oh, it's quite spectacular.
Yeah.
One of our guys, when we were starting to lay the track around here, I won't tell you who. If he watches it, he'll know. One day he was standing there 1 minute, and next minute he wasn't.
There we go.
And he stepped off the bridge, stood back to admire his handiwork, and fell in the river.
Oh dear.
We better get out of the way.
Moved up the line a little bit further away from the waterfall, and now we've got Tanygrisiau station in the background. So it's two tracks running round with the crossing just in front of us with the switches in the crossings. So we've nearly, very, very nearly at the end
Almost.
of the deviation.
Almost there, they say.
Almost.
We're getting there, as something used to say.
Yes.
With their two arrows that said clearly they didn't know where they were going. Yeah. When we first built this, which would be in the spring of '78, given that the train started running up to here in June, and we had a drawing, big drawing that came from the operating department of draftsmen, showing where to put it and how long to make it and everything. So we did what the drawing said.
Which is fair enough.
And it said, put the points here. So we put the points here. And we'd all done more or less lined up nice, and we were starting to lay the tracks. And he comes, just like a factory I worked in before I moved up here, where we fitted up graphic displays on panels of the plant he was going to control. And you glued them on with Evo stick, and you'd be halfway doing it, and the drawing office would come down, here's a revised drawing. And it was nothing like the first one, so we had to strip it all off and do it again. Yeah. Exactly the same here. We had to lift what was beautifully aligned, we had a lot of trouble with it, and move it to where it is now. Yeah. And I've found over the years several of this sort of things happened, and the second time around is never quite as good. You're annoyed, so you don't put the same effort into it. And it was never ever quite right. This curve here, I can't remember what its exact radius is, but it's amongst the sharpest on the whole railway. We had trap points built into it, because unlike the bulk of the railway, not all the railway, trains pass on the right. Here they passed on the left, partly because the incoming train, given that this was going to be a terminus for 4 years as it turned out, rather than bring the train in on this side and potentially block people from getting on and off it, it made sense to come in on that side. So, and this fitted in with my sort of policy of facing points. You always run in on the straight or the less curved leg, which was that track. And at the far end of it, I'd bought 5, I think it was, different design ones, with a straighter, fatter switch and a joggle, which aren't too good for trailing, but they're stronger, much better for facing.
So on the switch rail.
Looking eventually to it going to Blaenau, then the down train, which would be taking the curved leg there, would be on one that was built to take that. That's why we went for left-hand running here. And it seemed everybody was happy with it. It seemed to work perfectly, and even when we started going to Blaenau eventually, trains would come in this way on this line, and then all of a sudden it all changed. Never quite understood why, because I'd retired by then. So that they're actually entering on the sharp curve and grinding their way around here, and entering on the straight leg of one that's built to be robust enough to enter on the curved leg. But so be it. I can't say much because I retired, haven't I? But as this originally was the engine run round, somewhere here we built in provision for a trap point, effectively that would work with the main point so that they can't burst through it, and provision at the other end eventually for when it went on to Blaenau for a trap point. And then for some strange reason there was a change of mind. I know we don't want trap points, so we took all the switches and everything out, and only some years later, which we'll talk about if and when we make volume 4 of this wondrous tale, we put them back in again, because this was now a passing loop, and so presumably you could have 2 trains admittance because neither would hit the other if they overran. And the guy at the far end queried why this set of half points was pointing at his garden, and somebody said it's in case the train can't stop, and he thought, oh, he'll end up in my garden. So he phoned up somebody and probably shouted and yelled, and then we got told, oh, we don't need trap points. So we put them in, took them out, put them in, took them out.
A bit like, hokey cokey.
And we've done the same at the Ath, at Rhwng and Minford. Put them in, taken them out. There's one day, if I ever write a book, I think it'll be about the trap points I have built and unbuilt. and rebuilt somewhere else. Well, there's a train just starting its journey along the deviation, because we've now come to the end of it.
The end of it, as you can see, the gradual swoop, it starts to go back up towards Blaenau.
Yeah.
To the very end of the
So
railway.
I think the grade that we've just walked down is about 1 in 75, and then it gets back onto 1 in 80-ish.
Going in the opposite
Going
way.
back. So I suppose, thinking about what we were talking about, the line coming over the dam, and how is it going to get up to here? If it carried on at that grade, and bear in mind the track when we relayed it up there is on a lot of ballast, so it's a good 6 inches higher. If we carried on that grade and maybe steepened it to, I don't know, 1 in 60 or something, and straight through the station, it would have probably come down onto the end of the dam, maybe.
Well, there you go.
We were talking about the far end of the deviation, where we started at there, and we saw how the railway came, a 6'10" train burst out of a 7-foot cutting onto this almost standard gauge formation. Well, there's the other end of it, where it goes back into a 6'10" cutting up there. And at each end of this effectively are two of the tightest bits on the whole railway.
Yeah.
Potential head banging places, because people have got all along here, oh joy, we can put our heads out the windows, and maybe able to have sort of feed-in funnels.
Yes.
So I suppose where we've got to now is the end of volume 3.
Volume 3.
And we're looking up there at the beginning of volume 4.
Going up to Blaenau and Gwnaethpwyd.
So watch this space.
And see you next year.
That's a bit corny, wasn't it?